Hi, I'm Idra Novey, and I am pleased to welcome you to the 2023 Brooklyn Book Festival's virtual festival day for a conversation with Ariel Dorfman and Mariana Enriquez. We also hope to see you next week during the in-person festival takes place on October 1st in downtown Brooklyn. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. And now I'll share a bio from each of these astonishing writers. Ariel Dorfman is a Chilean-American author. He has prize-winning books published in over 50 languages, and his plays have been performed in over 100 countries. His works include Death and the Maiden, Purgatorio, Confidence, and Heading South, Looking North. He writes regularly for the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, The Nation, and The Guardian. His stories have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and Harper's. His newest novel is The Suicide Museum. He and his wife Angelica divide their time between Chile and North Carolina, where he is a Duke University Distinguished Emeritus Professor. Mariana Enriquez is one of the most spellbinding narrators in Latin American literature. Her debut novel, Bajar es lo peor, was published when she was a teenager, followed by the novel Cómo desaparecer completamente and the story collection Los peligros de fumar en la cama, which was shortlisted for the 2021 International Booker Prize and was a finalist for the Kirkus Prize. Her novel, Nuestra Parte de Noche, won the Heralde Novel Prize in 2019, the Premio Celsius, the Premio Kelvin, and most noteworthy, the Premio de la Crítica in 2019. And that book has now been translated into English and published this year by Megan McDowell, yes?
Yeah.
Is a tremendous translator.
Yeah.
And the English title is Our Share of Night. So it's a great honor to speak with both of you. I spoke with Mariana 2 years ago, I think, for a Spanish language program, which in fact is what I thought it was today, being that you're both Spanish language writers. And Ariel, I've been reading and admiring work for many years as my life has, I've moved back and forth to Chile for decades. So my first question for both of you about your books is about these tremendous leaps in time over decades that happen in both of your books, and how these leaps in time led to these, long works. And you've both written brief works, short stories, shorter novels. And I guess as a novelist myself, I'm curious to know, at what point did you have some intimation that these were going to be longer novels in their final form, and if that was something that revealed itself to you in the process? And if maybe you could just share a little bit about how the process of writing these longer works, distinguished in your minds. I wrote these questions and I was like, ¿cómo se distinguen? How they stood out in your minds in the process of, writing these longer works that required this longer form to get all these leaps in time over decades and that encompass, these larger sweeps of history.
Well, I mean, I think Mariana should go first because she wrote a short story where Adela appears, right?
Yeah.
Before launching her into this wonderful
it's in
so
the character from a short story is in the novel.
Right.
It was absolutely intentional. I wanted to write a very long novel. I've been wanting to write a very long novel that was a bit history and it was a bit genre, horror, fantastic, whatever you want to call it, for ages, and I didn't know how. So it was a bit of a leap, like, I will do it, and whatever comes out of it will be it. So I started, basically, I think the process of a long novel with leaps of time is not that difficult, let's say, because nowadays I think that thinking about the novel as something chronological in a big, long way, like a 19th century novel, I think it's almost impossible for us as writers. Like, we just don't perceive time that way. Everything is more fragmented. So that wasn't really an issue. And what was an issue is that some parts are in the 60s. You know, I'm going to be 50, but I didn't live the 50s, the 60s at all. And even in the 80s, that part is during the Argentinian dictatorship, but at the end of it, I barely remember it. So that was more of a, I remember how it felt. I remember it felt scary and phantasmagoric. That's why I thought it was a very good era for my novel. But that implied a bit of research and asking and, you know, and trying to, with the little memories I had, to make it. But basically it was long process, which is kind of obvious, but at the same time, I mean, a long process in the sense of you don't know where it's going to end, and then the characters have a lot of agency. Like sometimes I felt that they really wanted to do whatever they wanted to do, and I had to let them, which doesn't really happen in a short story. A short story, it's much more controlled. So it's like being at sea, you know, like you know where you're going, but things can happen and you have to change, and it's slow. It's not, you know, it's not a sudden change. Or anyway, but it was a lot of fun too, because I felt very you know, as a writer, sometimes when you're comfortable, and I was very comfortable with short stories at this point, it's nice to, you know, just let go and say, okay, let's, you know, let's do something that is challenging. And I really, really love the novel. So yeah, I guess that's the point. It was more than time. What was different was recreating the past.
Okay, so I'll go now. I have written a couple of really long novels. I wrote The Last Hombre Sondero, which is the narration of a group of fetuses that refuse to be born until the adults change the world. And that has 5 or 6 different sequences with comic strips in the middle of it, and exiles in Mexico and all sorts of things there. So I'd done that. And then in another one, which was the Nanny and the Iceberg, it was a long, long thing about the iceberg that the Chileans take to Sevilla to show how modern they are, of course, which is an act of absolute delirious arrogance on the part of people who think that they're modern and they're not really modern at all, right? So I'd already done that in that sense. And so when I started this novel, I had been toying with the idea for many, many years of an exile who goes back to Chile to investigate whether Salvador Allende committed suicide or if Salvador Allende was murdered. There are 2 different theses. There are more than 2, let's say, but those were the main ones, right? And I never could figure out quite who that narrator would be, who that protagonist would be. Around 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 years ago, I decided that, in fact, the best person to do that was myself. I mean, myself, meaning an alter ego, who would be weighed down by all the chronology, the exact historical, fehaciente, you could say, chronology, the exact chronology of my life. He would have my name, my books, my wife, Angelica, my children, my friends. He would go back to Chile in 1990 as I did. He would leave Chile at the end of 1990 as I did. He would write Death and the Maiden as I did. All those things would be exactly there. I was stuck in the straitjacket in that sense. But I felt that liberated me to investigate, because I hadn't gone to Chile to investigate the death of Allende at all, right? So I made him into a detective. The second thing I needed somebody to send him on this mission. And I had a second obsession, which I had been toying with also for a long time, which had to do with apocalypse, climate change. So I had a character, the second protagonist, you could say, who was Joseph Horta, who is a Dutch billionaire who, for reasons of his own and for secrets of his own, needs to find out whether Allende killed himself or was killed because of a suicide museum. He wants to build a suicide museum to wake up humanity to the fact that we are all committing suicide very slowly. So I had to bring these 2 things together. Juan Gabriel Vasquez just said in El País this morning that what's interesting about my novel is it's impredecible, it's unpredictable. And of course, my life is extraordinarily predictable because it already happened, right? It happened, can't happen in a different way. I'm not going to move out of that history as such as the structure, right? Like Mariana cannot make believe that there was not a dictatorship during part of what she was doing, right? But she has those hitos, those historical moments, which she has to respect. And then the characters, of course, will live and weave in and out of that, right? Out of that life of the country of Argentina itself. So I had to do that. And then when I started, I thought this is going to be a very, very quick novel because I like to write quickly, so I can go on to the next one. And I thought it would be a year at the most. And it wasn't, because as I went forward, just like in Mariana's case, and it's always happened, right? The characters go wherever they want. They go in all sorts of directions. And I also had a strange obsession because, Mariana was born in 1973, and 1973 is the year when I went into exile. And I'm 81 years old. So I don't know how many years I'm going to have. And I have a series of very interesting, I hope, projects. And I thought, I'm going to integrate into this novel, like Cervantes would, right? I'm going to integrate different stories that I want told and that have to do with all of this. So I created the story of a wedding photographer who can tell the future of the couples that he's photographing, right? That has to do with the idea, can we tell the future or not tell the future? What happens if we know the future and we're looking at the future, the disaster is going to come and we're not doing anything about it, right? Or the story that I had begun thinking about in the embassy, the Argentine embassy, La Embajada Argentina, where I sought asylum. And I thought, and somebody came into the embassy, and I thought to myself, wow, if somebody comes into this embassy, like happens in the novel, The Suicide Museum, somebody could come in and kill somebody there, right? So I created this whole structure of a murderer loose inside the embassy in Argentina. And I could just add several other things like Holocaust survivors and other things. And I all integrated them. The idea, that's why it took so long, because I had to integrate them very slowly into that so they wouldn't be lost forever.
Well, what I thought integrated a lot of elements, in the Suicide Museum and our state as humans on a flaming planet, and also, the many different parts in Mariana's book is this sort of like pervasive melancholy in both of the novels of certain things that can't be resolved, a sadness that's, devastating, but you have to live alongside it anyhow. Like, I think, the characters in both of your novels are sort of continually, doing what Italo Calvino defined as melancholy is sort of like sadness, with its weight subtracted, because, you're just carrying it with you, but it is, you're still moving forward, right? So that like melancholy almost is sort of like a moving sadness that like accompanies the movement of your novels in a way. They move, both have this forward momentum, but there is this drag, right, of this profound sadness that's sort of pulling at the characters throughout the novel. And I just wondered if, this definition, resonated with both of you when you were thinking about your main characters and, they're trapped in these impossible situations, of just like impossible choices, and are dragging this melancholy with them, even as their lives continue. And so, just if that definition from Italo Calvino sort of makes sense, and I was just, if how to write these novels that have these heartbreaking elements to them, but at the same time have this forward movement.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think all horror in general is very sad because it deals with death, it deals with grief at the end of it. Even if, people are cheering at the movies because, the killer is coming, still is a killer killing a young girl. So at the end of it, it's like very sad. But also in the novel, I was playing a lot with the idea of the Victorian, like late 19th century paralysis of the, of the symbolist. And, there was very trendy to just lay in your couch and be there, the neurasthenia, all that stuff is kind of the mood, because it's not a Gothic novel. I think it's more like a Victorian kind of thing. But that preceded the Great War, the First Great War. And for some reason, I living in Argentina, and Ariel probably knows what I mean. You always feel in a kind of state of paralysis, like things don't move. So part of the melancholia, and you would say depression in a way, depression has all kinds of forms, but one of the forms of depression is this kind of not being able to move, and at the end, not being able to feel, which is kind of, after I lived here 50 years, I've never left the country, though I have opportunities, and many of my friends did. In my generation, is not political exile, but economic exile. So this feeling of not being, like being in a, in a kind of swamp. It's a swampy situation, like this is never going to be fixed. And right now in Argentina, we have like a very interesting political situation where we have a candidate that is very, very far right, and he's quite intense
and insane.
Like he talks to his dogs. I mean, we have a tradition in Argentina of kind of esoteric stuff in power. Like in 73, I think was in power. Perón was in power, but but his main man was a spiritualist, López Rega. There was kind of, he was like, I mean, with when Perón died, he was grabbing Perón by his feet and saying to him, "Don't leave me, Pharaoh." He would call him Pharaoh, like Egyptian Pharaoh. Like, this is true. And I mean, and Chile has a, some kind of esoteric stuff during the dictatorship too. Like, so somehow power, when it goes very crazy, it goes full on mystic at some point. But that's another thing. But yeah, I feel that the melancholia, and that's why when they ask our generation if we are influenced by the Latin American boom, Garcia Marquez and stuff, those are writers I read and adored, but they had optimism. You read them, you read 100 Years of Solitude, and there's a lot of vitality, and this is a book after the Cuban Revolution. This is a book that is full of hope in the continent, and we, at least me, and I think the generation after the dictatorship in Argentina, we just don't feel that anymore. So many of our stories started to be very gothic, very sad. Yeah. So I think it's a state of melancholia that I chose for the genre because it's necessary, but at the same time, it's a kind of state of being. Even if you come here, it's like party all the time, but there is some kind of sense of, when is this going to be better, please? And that paralysis is, to me, is very evident. Yeah.
In my case, it's rather different, though I was born in Argentina, so I should be melancholy, but I'm not really. The point about this book, and it happens to me as well, which are all the characters have a tremendous sense of loss. It may be that it's melancholy, or it may be that it's a sort of a sadness. It's a sadness of opportunities that were not fully developed. I mean, there's nothing worse, one of the characters says, than wasted lives, right? And one of the things that was wonderful about Chile, and it differentiates in many ways from Argentina and from many other countries in the world, is that we did have this revolution which was not going to kill anybody. It was a democratic revolution. It it was an extraordinary experience. Those 1,000 days of Allende were the best days of my life by far. They were the best days of my wife. They were the best days of my friends. And the fact that we were unable to carry that through to fruition was a terrible tragedy for our people and for so many who died, right, in that sense. So there were many mistakes made, but also it was a terrible tragedy for the world because we were an example for how you can do things differently, right? You do not have to go into the Sierra. You don't have to begin to kill people. You don't have to kidnap people. You don't have to do that. You don't. In other words, we didn't have to go the Argentine way of the ERP or the Montoneros, etc. We had that, of course, there was part of it, and yet they were sort of, even the MIR was sort of integrated into this movement of a Chilean people who had, from Recabarren onwards, in fact, way before, from Bilbao onwards, there was a whole tendency towards the idea that within the system, with all the coups and the different things, because it's not that we're, it's not true that we are like apart from Latin America. That's an idea of the right wing of the modernization in Chile that says, we're leaving adios Latinoamérica, goodbye Latin America. We belong to the first world. They don't belong to the first world. We don't belong to the first world. We belong to the other world, or whatever world that is, but it's a different one. So that sense of the loss of opportunity is something that pervades everybody in this book. And of course, there's also the other character, right? Who is this billionaire who thought he was going to change the world by creating this plastic empire and has ended up polluting the planet. So it's as if these characters are looking for some way out, and they're looking for that hope. And of course, for me, Garcia Marquez is not only, and Cortázar is one of my dearest friends. I mean, so for me, he's not in a book. These are people that I lived with, that I worked with all my life. And I feel as if I wanted always to be a bridge. Now, one of the things that the dictatorship does, and it did it to you, Mariana.
Yeah.
Is it broke the bridges between generations, right?
Yeah.
So that it was for many, many years for you, it was forbidden to read certain books and forbidden to meet certain people. And then the enormous amount of exiles that went away, right?
Yeah.
So the country was broken in a way that had never been broken before, because you can't compare the proceso, right, that you lived through to what had happened before, right? When Irigoyen was, no, it's different. This was a decision, part of the whole global decision to disappear a whole dream, the whole idea of the idea that what we can change the world in a different way, right? And I think all your characters are destroyed by this, the fact that they can't do this. Luis is a character who wanted to do this, and he can't do it, right? He can't do it. It's a terrible tragedy, right? Luis fits in some ways into my novel, right? In that sense, he's the sort of character who's speaking about Allende, speaking about the cemetery, and speaking about how Allende would go and give milk to the children. It's a different situation, right? Being pueblos hermanos, being really fraternal and sororities next to each other. But that sense of tremendous loss is something that the Ariel character goes back to Chile saying, if I can only find, I, meaning that person, right, who represents me, can find the answer to the mystery of Allende. Did he kill himself? Or was he murdered? If I can reach a consensus about this, maybe we can reach a consensus about other things, such as no more violence. We can reach a consensus about the need for justice, the need for ecological change, etc. Right? And of course, it's not that I fail in that, but I end up with two different interpretations, simultaneous interpretations. One saying that Allende killed himself, one saying that Allende was murdered. And how I did that is something that I still think is probably the best thing I did in the novel, which is surprising, right? Because I didn't expect that.
Ariel, I was thinking about you because I was in Santiago for the 50th anniversary.
I know. You were very destacada there.
I know. I
People
did.
were very happy to see you there.
I was scared about how I was, about my dress and stuff like that. But anyway, and I posted a picture of the shoes of Allende that are exhibited in the door that was closed like forever. That was the door that he used to enter La Moneda.
And where he went out for the last time.
Yeah.
Right.
So I posted a picture. It's a very kind of moving image because it's very simple. It looks like Van Gogh in a way. I don't know. It looks like a painting, and it's so it has a lot of sadness, but yes, yet dignity. Anyway, I posted it on my social media, and I said the shoes which as in the war when he was killed, because to me he was killed.
Yes.
Like I was listening to you and I said, yeah, I don't know, like it's there's versions, but in a way he was killed he didn't have a way out because he decided that also, like many other people could run away, but he didn't have the choice because he didn't want to
Because of
have
who he
that
was.
choice. He was going to be killed anyway, by a
was
bomb
killed.
or by himself.
Yes.
So to me, he was killed. And you have no idea how many people, Chileans mostly, because Argentinians don't know, were like, don't change history. He wasn't murdered. Like, in a way, protecting the attackers.
Right.
And so I changed it. And I just said the shoes he wore when he died, because I was like, I don't want to have this kind of confrontation anymore between people. Like it's suddenly like a, very normal social media thing was a battleground. And I've been in a battleground
Right.
of discourses, because we didn't have the kind of violence in my generation forever. And it's like, it's just a pair of shoes of a decent man that died. Like,
no, but
stop it.
He's being disputed. In other words,
Yes.
he is still an enigma, which is being disputed because people say he died fighting and therefore he's heroic, or did he kill himself and therefore it's tragic? And it can be epic and tragic, right?
Yeah.
But that has to do with Mariana, one of the problems that we have as writers is that we love ambiguity, right?
Yeah.
we love ambiguity. And Idra, you love ambiguity as well. I mean, that's obvious from your work, right? So, but it turns out that people love to read about ambiguity, but they don't want to feel ambiguous themselves. They want to know for sure it was like this or like that. And in fact, they decide ahead of time what they believe, and then they construct the facts so that it works for their interpretation of things, right? So
yeah,
that's where it goes. And I plunge into that. It's a maelstrom, it's a whirlpool, right? It's very risky because I'm trying to say to Chileans, but other people as well, the past is constantly being reinterpreted. You have a phrase at the very beginning of your novel which say, the past is whatever you want it to be, right? One of the characters says to the other one, right? You interpret it any way you want. And that's true. So how do you do that, having the past be anything you want it to be, and at the same time keep a sense of decency, a sense of morality, a sense of ethics, which I think, by the way, is one of the problems that your characters have got, right? How can they stay straight and be moral and ethical in the middle of this darkness that surrounds them and wants to eat everything up, right? So the same thing happens to me in that sense. I'm trying to find some anchor in the middle of this turmoil, and I hope I find it. But it's not easy, right? It's not easy because you don't want to lie. You don't want to tell people comforting stories because reality is not comforting.
Well,
Exactly.
Mariana, I thought it was ironic you had it called The Order, and it's really, it's called The Order, but it's actually a form of disorder, so that it's sort of doing the opposite. And I wonder, you're writing about these historical moments, but you're both talking about the present and the political leaders in the present, and how, in your case, Mariana, they sort of shape your sense of resignation and melancholy because there's a sense of stalemate, right? Of an impasse in terms of creating a time of sort of collective well-being that doesn't feel within reach. And I think that feeling is pervasive in Chile right now, with the dissolution of the last version of the Constitution, and people are sort of, don't know if Boric is going to be able to find a way forward. And I just wondered whether you're writing about the past and, in fictionalized ways or not, that, you know, for in Chile, there's been such radical shifts between the presidency of Boric, Piñera, Bachelet, you know, Lagos, and then Argentina, these huge shifts, Mariana, that you referred to, you know, from Peronismo and everything since then. How those shifts, and when you're thinking about, you know, sort of, Ariel, you referred to these bridges, right, that get broken between generations, depending on the level of melancholy that a generation experiences. Just wonder how much that impacted the books you wrote, thinking about that, given that the books move in time, and how maybe there is this sort of collective sense of hope or despair, depending on what moment in history and, you know, what government marks a generation.
Yeah.
It's strange because I always felt personally, as a generation, orphaned. Because obviously the generation that was killed is my parents' generation. I don't know, Ariel, how the age of your children, but it's probably, if you have children, but they're probably about my age, maybe younger.
There's one 55 and one is 42 or 43. So yes, they both,
exactly.
yeah.
So that's, and my parents weren't killed, but they were very traumatized because they knew a lot of people, and you have also, that's something that is never spoken that much when about the dictatorships, that bridge that Ariel was mentioned, that broken thing is not just something broken in history or the things that you cannot read. It's not the political is personal, says feminism, and it's true. Because what you have there is a generation of your elders, let's say, that are traumatized, scared, sometimes unable to raise you. Sometimes it was very interesting what he was saying, like a lot of fetuses that refuse to be born until the world is better. And you kind of sense that from your parents, that if it was not that they didn't want to have you, do you understand? It's like more like, it's, you know, it's worth it to have someone in other cases, like the people that were in revolutionary spaces and armies, they were like even training the children. I have friends that know how to how to grab a gun, and they are, when they were 5 they were trained. So it's very crazy here, really. And so what I feel is that bridge, it's always something. I think there's a reason why Our Share of Night is a story about parenting, in a way.
Oh, yes.
About a father and a child mainly, but not just. Because then Gaspar is the main protagonist and go to his uncle he was in exile, like he was political exile, and he's a very decent man, and he can't, turn fate. He's one of the most tragical characters. I prepare his demise a lot, like, because I have fun. I'm not like I can, touch in this to melancholia, but I have a lot of fun doing that. But also the parents, the rich parents, like from the order, that they cannot be, because to me it's power more than a certain power. But they also think that they have not to love their children in a way to be like some kind of moral superiority. And I always felt like in these processes, in this in these dictatorships in our continent, there had to be a lot of, the young were the ones that were killed, the young and the vulnerable.
Yeah.
So the person that is doing that has to have a lot of contempt to that, has to be. So I think I was thinking recently, because they make you think about your novel a lot after you publish it. Then it's for you is one thing, and then it changes. But it is kind of a novel about being an orphan, not in the sense that my parents are dead, but that generation is a generation that has emerge from a terrible trauma that is not in any way resolved.
Mhm.
And that my parents are alive by chance, you know? And they didn't pay that much attention to me because they were trying to heal themselves, or the attention they paid was totally messed up. That's why in a way, you know, of course, Juan, the main protagonist, is more than messed up, but there's a kind of, you know, crazy love there, like, you know, trying to make the child not repeat the history, and at the same time not being able to make him repeat the history. So I don't think it's absolutely autobiographical or metaphoric, but in the end, I think it's way more than what it suggests. Of course, there's demons too. So,
Right.
you know.
Right. Well, I want to begin by saying that about Boric, right? Whether he turns this around or not, there's one thing about him which is fantastic, and he loves poetry, he loves reading, he wants to be a poet himself. So Allende was somebody who loved art, and Boric is somebody who loves poetry, and Pinochet was somebody who loved torture. And there you have the whole history of Chile, right? So let me go to this idea of parents, fathers, and children, right? Because the book, of course, one tends to say, oh, it's a book about Allende. No, it's a book about fathers and sons in great measure. Mm-hmm. The Suicide Museum is in great measure a story about Horta's father, who is a communist, a very rigid communist, and the relationship of Horta when he was a child with this man and later, and the secrets that will be revealed about what guilt he has in relation to what his father has created, right? So there's that sense of that, and there's the sense of Allende as a sort of a substitute father, where both Ariel, the alter ego for me, the avatar of mine, and Joseph Horta himself, and a series of other characters are looking back to Allende as if he were a father, a dead father, who in one sense we live with him and we live without him. And how do we live? How do we enter into dialogue with somebody who becomes a myth, who has ended up saying the most famous speech in Latin America from the last moments of his life, right? Telling people what to do and what not to do with el metal tranquilo de su voz. The tranquil metal of my voice will not reach you anymore. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's an extraordinary moment. And I wasn't there. I wasn't there to be by his side. I wasn't there to defend him as I had promised to do, though I put myself in La Moneda for the last months of there, right? And I switched places with somebody else. And therefore that person died in my place and I didn't die. And I'm a survivor. So as such, I'm looking for the father, right? I'm looking for that. Even if my own dad, who is Argentinian and anyway, so the thing is, this thing about fathers and sons is very central. And this character is constantly remembering. He is, in some sense, a guardian of the memory of Chile, because he remembers how the 4th of September of 1970, people were shouting, Allende, Allende, el pueblo te defiende, right? Outside when Allende was elected. And then exactly 17 years later, 20 years later, on the 4th of September 1990, Allende is buried. He's given an official burial. And Ariel is there, and he's outside the cathedral. He's about to go in. And the people are shouting, Allende, Allende, el pueblo defiende, outside. And he says, I belong there. No, in fact, 20 years later, I belong in there with all the elite. I belong with the Allende family has invited me to be the person who's going to monitor with Sergio Ramirez and Antonio Scarmeta and a series of other people. We're going to monitor the cultural panel next day, which is totally true. I mean, that you can look it up in the newspapers, right? That happened, right? I was invited by Tencha Allende and by Isabel Allende to do that. So he realizes that the people are now outside. They're not inside the cathedral. Then he goes to the cemetery. They're outside the cemetery. And the same cops who've been beating them up for 17 years or for all this time, they're the same people who are going to beat them up because they don't let them into the cemetery to visit Allende's tomb. Later on, he goes with his son, Joaquin, to visit Allende's tomb again. And there he finds those moments of hope, those bridges. He finds that outside Allende's tomb on November 4th, which of course is also the 20th anniversary of Allende's assumption of power, and also the next to the Day of the Dead and all this, everybody has come to leave flowers, but they've also left all sorts of messages. And the messages say, Tata Allende, in other words, Grandfather Allende, help me with my math exam. Oh, make Francisca love me. Or I hope that my parents can accept me, meaning I'm gay. Or please, why somebody who's about to commit suicide and asking Allende to intervene, San Allende from the other side, right? So Mariana has San Muerte, right? And I have San Allende. And that means a great deal of difference in relation to how the novel is structured. Because Joaquin is there and he's unhappy, this younger son of mine in Chile. He doesn't fit there, just like I don't fit anymore in that country. And I'm trying to explain why I'm leaving. And a little girl comes and she brings a present to Allende, to Chicho. Chicho, I mean, that's Salvador Chicho, Salvadorcito. They used to call it Allende like that. We would call him Chicho. So she brings a little car, a little red car, and she moves it like this to make sure it's working because she doesn't want the president to think that she's giving him a car that doesn't work. And this is true. These things happened. And the parents say, and he says, I don't know what to do. The little girl says she twists her little, like that, her dress. And the parents say, here's this young man. What's your name? Joaquin. Oh, just like our uncle who's in Sweden. You don't know the uncle, says the little girl, Violeta, right? Violeta Parra. It's full of signs like that. Young man, what should she call him? Well, they call him Chicho. They call him this. I'm going to call him Chicho. Here it is, Chicho. Make sure that you play with it well, right? Now, that is Chile in some sense. But of course, it's also Chile is also the people who destroyed us, who were accomplices, who turned a blind eye and looked elsewhere, and who are corrupting the country. Because when people are tortured and you say nothing, and you make believe it didn't happen, and then you say, if there's another coup, it's okay, as long as it defends our interests, that country ends up being corroded and corrupted and morally degenerate, right? And of course, that has to do with a great loss, right? Because that wasn't Chile before. And of course, I feel for that. And I'm trying to refine that hope, because that hope that Allende represented is the sort of hope we need, the consequences we need, something consequential, who can help us move towards the major issues of our time, which is we are going towards a graveyard. We will have nobody to mourn us. We are being disappeared. We are going to disappear ourselves. So whether Allende committed suicide or not is a question that I'm not going to answer. It's answered in the novel. But whether we will destroy ourselves, we are doing it. And we need the example of people like Allende to help guide us into a different sort of future.
Well, we're running short on time, but I mean, just having lived back and forth in Chile for many decades now, that and living here, I do think there are many different Chiles that happen simultaneously, and I wrote an intro recently for Pedro Lemebel's Crónicas, which are going to come out in English. And
oh, good! I'm glad.
During the dictatorship.
So know Soledad Yankee, right? You know
sorry,
Soledad
what?
Yankee.
Who?
Who has done all her work on Pedro Lemebel.
Yes. Well, yeah. Well, I think that it's speaking of Chile. I mean, the class stratification and the lack of class mobility that was there even before Allende, and continues to this day is and I know class in Argentina, Mariana, you've written so much about that, and this sort of how frozen it can be, and how much that plays into sort of that sense of stasis,
yes.
Political stasis, that you both
also
wrote about.
Sorry, but also because we used to have it. Like Argentina really had like the class. Like my father is an example of that. He was almost the son of, people who couldn't read and write from Galicia. And then he became an engineer, and he was a very, very, very well-read and, sophisticated man. And he was called Salvador also. But they didn't call him Chicho because he didn't like it. It's like the most usual. It's the usual, Also, he was not funny looking. He was not, he
so
was
you
very.
call the twins Salvador and Juan?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Look at that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not analyzing.
Yeah. But anyway, and but the what I wanted to say, and sorry to interrupt you, is that we used to have it, and we are not seeing it anymore.
No.
I didn't see it that much, more or less. Like, you know, I still could, for example, because of free education and stuff, have a very good education, and you know, I don't know, learn languages and stuff like that, and I went to the university for free, etc. But that is kind of, we are losing that.
Yes. Yeah. And Chile is as well. I mean, you know, neoliberalismo and everything since then. But I think that, you know, the scope, how capacious these new novels from both of you are, allow for the intersection, you know, of all of those different factors and moving into time. They're just, you know, they're majestic works of fiction. So it was a real honor to speak with both of you.
Could I say one thing, Idra? I'd like to add something, okay? I know, I think we still have a little time, and I'm sure Mariana also wants to say something. You know, one of the characteristics of my work is that I take genres that are popular and I subvert them.
Yeah.
In Death and the Maiden, I subvert the thriller. In Darwin's Ghost, I subvert the ghost story. In Confidence, I subvert the spy novel over and over again. In this case, I take out of fiction and I break the boundaries of literature, which is something I think is very important to say. In other words, you know, people tend to think that if somebody like me is politically involved, they're necessarily sort of like very staid and dull and rigid, and they stick to one thing. It's not true at all. On the contrary, you know, we're full of life, we're full of joy. And part of the joy is breaking the boundaries of literature, especially the novel. The novel is a form that is capacious, as you said. It can break all the boundaries possible. And I think that a great deal of the most interesting fiction today in Latin America, Mariana is one example. Rodrigo Fresan is another example. I think he's a friend of yours, right?
Yes.
Juan Gabriel Vázquez is another example. Alejandro Zambra is another example. Héctor Abad is another example. Over and over again, they are breaking down the boundaries between the memoir and the essay and the poetry and all that, right? And I think that's also very Latin American, because the most Latin American thing about Borges was that he was absorbing from all the cultures, right? There's nobody as cultured as in the world as Jorge Luis Borges. He was Argentine, and he knew about the Califas and this and the other. So we're very Latin American. It's a very Latin American thing to do, which is to grab a genre that comes from outside, like you've done with the Victorian horror story in some sense, right?
Yeah.
Right. And break it open in different directions, right? Fill it with the swamps of Posadas and Corrientes and Misiones, right? Yeah. Or with La Plata, which rarely appears, right? La Plata, where my dad, by the way, used to teach La Plata before he was kicked out. And then he said, I'm not kicking you out. So anyway, I just wanted to say this. This is something very important to say. We are contributing to the destruction of previous literature by enriching it, making it ours, and passing it on to the next generations as they come. And this is something that, as Mariana said, it's a great joy to do this.
Well, it seems like a perfect note to close on. Thank you both so much for taking part in this virtual event. To Anna, who's just incredible how many hats she wears every hour to make this festival happen, and everyone with the Brooklyn Book Festival. And to all of you listening, you can order books in the link below, and please consider making a donation to keep the Brooklyn Book Festival going. It is celebrating its 18th year of presenting free literary programming in person and online to everyone. And if you are in New York City next week, the in-person festival will take place on October 1st in downtown Brooklyn. I'll be on a in-person panel, I think at 11 o'clock, about echoes of art and literature with Brandon, I can't remember, there was a full list, Catherine Lacey, John Ray, Brandon Slocum. It'd be wonderful to meet people in person. And thank you both so much. It was an honor to talk with you about your new books. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.